Good evening, and welcome to W.R. Frady's Live Ghost Stories by the Fireside. Unfortunately, tonight's Ghost Stories will not be live as I am out of town. The same will also be in effect for next week. However, I will be back live again with you very soon, especially as we wrap up this fifth and final season. But what are we waiting for? You came for Ghost Stories. So let's start with a few shout outs. First of all, I would like to thank each and every one of you who have either joined me since the very beginning or have joined in since along the way. For you have made this series not only possible, but very well worth doing. I thank you, appreciate you, and give each and every one of you a shout out for it. I'd like to thank my Lacey Road gang for all the adventures and the support and the love they've shown over the years. I would also like to give a shout out to Be Your Own Hero Productions with projects like the upcoming feature film You're It, The Rescue, the short anthology from the Book of Fate series. I'd like to Stroh's Sinister Cinema and The Devil's Daughter, as well as many, many more projects to come. You're It is set to be released in February of 2025, so do stay tuned for that. Also, I would like to give a shout out and a warm shout out to Lake Hickory Haunts, who is celebrating their 13 years of scares this year. They allowed us to use Lake Hickory Haunts as a set for You're It. About 85% or better of the movie was filmed there on location. So be sure to show some love to Lake Hickory Haunts. Get out there and get your scares in for the Halloween season. I'd like to give a shout out to Blowing Rock Brewing Company and to South Mountain Distilling Company, both of whom were great major sponsors for the film You're It. Be sure to go by and give them some love if you're in the area. Buy a drink, tell them you heard it from W.R. Frady and the Be Your Own Hero group. Also, would love to give a shout out to my Canadian brother, Chad of Moonrunner 83. Brother, if you've been watching, you've been making some good music and doing what you need to do. I hope you're having a wonderful October up there. I know it's getting ready to get very cold up there in Calgary, and man, props and a big shout out to you, brother. Be good, be safe. I also want to give two of my special Lacey Road gang a quick shout out, both Clint Ferguson and Aaron Rogers, who were with me last week. I thank you for everything that you did in last week's show. So yeah, definitely, I appreciate that. Oh, give me just a second. Oh, sorry. All right, sorry about that. Had a momentary interruption. Like to invite you to go to theebonstonetower.com. It's the home of all things W.R. Frady. It's the home of Darkhaven Manor and the Vampire Killer. It's the home of the Wise Oak, home of Ballador, the Island of Igraine. It's the home of Whispery Hollow and the Lovelady Township and the Legends of Lacey Road and Legends of Lacey Road and other tales for the Fireside. Want to thank you. Be sure to stop by Wolf Moon Studios, my personal gallery, and potential movie studio as well, for any films that I may or may not take up in doing. That's a project in the works. We'll see how that goes. Also, be sure to check out the Cantankerous Cauldron and see what's going on in the mind of W.R. Frady. And, you know, hopefully I'll have these series up on there soon for everyone to enjoy. If not up on there, on YouTube, to where you can go to the Evanstone Tower and find the link and follow it straight to the YouTube's channel. Anyway, without further ado, let's get started with some ghost stories. Tonight, we're going to do other legends called the Tales for the Fireside. So tonight, I know Legends of Lacey Road are probably going to take a back seat for tonight, but I've got 3 original tales for you. And when I say original, these have yet to be written down even. But they will be, very soon. The first I would like to tell, I have called the Blue Boy of Willow Knob. Now, the old house at the end of Willow Street, it was an old and derelict house, an old manor. And it was large, lofty, had many rooms. But one room was particularly drafty. The room and the in the loft on the north side of the house was always cold, shadowy, and drafty, and that was in the summer, let alone in the winter when the wind blew and the snow fell and the frost caressed the window with a grip that almost would make you think that it was about to break inside. There used to live a boy named Billy and his father, Gerald. Now, Gerald was a good dad. He loved his son. He loved his wife too at one point, but when Billy was still but a toddler, his wife grew ill. And Gerald's wife grew ill and unfortunately passed away. And so Billy was left to be raised by his father, who loved him dearly and tried to give him the best he could, being a single dad and raising his son and taking care of him and providing for him. But he always felt that Billy deserved to have a mother. So Gerald began to court some of the ladies in town. Well, eventually he came across one named Evelyn. Now, Evelyn seemed like she was the perfect mom, the perfect wife, the perfect woman. She just, when Gerald was around, she was loving to Billy. She was willing to do the things that she needed to do, cook, clean, help Gerald support the household in any way she could. And so they began seeing one another and became engaged. And the marriage date was set. However, everything was good with Evelyn while Gerald was around. However, when Gerald wasn't around, her true colors showed through. Oh, she was spiteful. She was mean and abusive, and she was always fussing at Billy for the slightest things, or always punishing him for next to nothing. And oftentimes, she would, when she really wanted to punish Billy, she would stick him in that northern room in the loft and lock the door and not let him out for sometimes hours at a time. Sometimes she would only let him out in time to eat. However, when Gerald would come back home, that would change. And it was all loving, and Billy just didn't know what to think of it. I mean, he was tiny. He was a small little boy. And this went on for several months, but then the winter winds began to blow. And in that time, Gerald had to leave town to go on a business trip. A business trip that would set them up not only for the rest of the winter, but also ensure that everything would be in place for the coming wedding. Well, as he did, as he left, he fully believed Billy was in good hands with Evelyn. Well, as soon as Gerald was gone, Evelyn was back to her old games, sitting there punishing poor Billy for nothing at all. And if he even walked in the door slightly dirtier than he walked out, or if he walked in the door even slightly dirtier than he walked out, or if he shut the door a little too hard, it was off to that room and locked. And by that, well, one day, when in a fit of excitement and play, Billy came running into the house and shut the door a little harder than even any parent would like. Evelyn felt like she had had enough, so she took him upstairs and put him in that room and locked the door. And as she went back downstairs, a knock come at the door. It was one of her friends from the other side of town, had come to drop in and visit and chat with her a while. Well, Evelyn got so wrapped up and so caught up in the gossip and the conversation with her friend that she completely forgot about Billy until the moment when her friend was about to leave, and then turned around and asked where the little boy was. Oh my God, she thought, I forgot about him and he's been up there all this time. So she just lied and said that he was off playing and said that he'd be home soon and such. And once her friend was out the door, Evelyn grabbed her key and raced up the stairs. Now, it had been a bitterly cold day that day with the wind blowing, and it was already cold outside. It was already cold in the house, even with the heat from the old wood stoves going. But that drafty old room, it was nearly as cold up there as it was outside. And when she had went inside, opened the door and went inside, she was horrified. For Billy had succumbed to the cold and froze to the death from being in the attic up in that old drafty room for so long. When Gerald came home, he was devastated to hear that he had lost his son. Now he had lost both his former wife and his son. His entire world was shattered. And he was so devastated from the loss of his son that he called off the engagement and the wedding, not knowing still yet the truth behind what happened and how his son, how he actually lost his son. So Evelyn had begun to pack her things, but she was still staying there. And the father had to leave town for a little while to try to get to deal with the matters of his son's passing. Well, that night, as Evelyn was packing, she grew weary and laid down in the bed like she normally would. And as she laid there, she heard the pattering of feet that sounded almost like little Billy's when he was walking through the house. And those feet, the footprints, the steps, approached the room where she was in. And she was like, waiting. And all you could just, I'm cold. I'm cold. Let me out. I'm cold. And Evelyn just pulled the blankets up around her, and she didn't want to look, so she turned her back to the sound and was just hoping that maybe it was a dream, maybe it was something that it was not, or maybe it was just her conscience playing on her for the tragedy that happened. But she rolled over. She heard the door to the room open, and the little footsteps come in the room. Cold. It's so cold. And so she laid there. She tried to pretend she didn't hear it. Then she heard it right next to the bed. I'm cold. I'm cold. I gotta get warm. I'm so cold. And she ignored it. She's sinking to herself. She was like, you're gone. You're dead. You're not here anymore. I'm just imagining this. And then she felt the covers lift up and a small form crawl into bed with her. And she felt bone-chilling, numbing, cold hand and arm reach around her and wrap itself around her. And so cold. Warm me up. And she started to scream and get up, but she couldn't, as the apparition of little Billy held her in place. Cold. It's so cold. Warm me up. You left me where it's cold. And then the room itself grew colder than any ice she had ever felt. It was though the winter winds had swept into the house and centered on her. Well, when the sun rose the next morning and Gerald had come back home, he had found Evelyn laying in the bed where she had always slept, only she had frozen to death in the night. The old house still stands there on Willow Knob, and those who stay there, those who visit there, say that even to this day, if you go to stay there in the night, you will see a little boy in blue, just completely enveloped in blue, will be walking in his luminescent form down from that old room in the loft on the north end. And you'll hear him chattering, his teeth chattering, and him complaining that it's cold, it's so cold. And most people who've seen him say that they'll just see him sitting there hoping that someone will start a fire or something and try to warm him. And those who do say that he pleasantly fades out in the distance. But if someone has a cold heart, has been cruel, or even is even ill, sick, he will crawl into bed with them, and they will pass away by morning light. I hope you enjoyed The Blue Boy of Willow's Knob. Our next story kind of centers around how everyone loves telling ghost stories by Fireside. You see, for as long as we can remember in mankind, in our history, men and women have often, even back into the frontier days and such, will gather around a fire and tell tales of mystery and the supernatural and folklore about things that were witnessed or happened or were believed to have happened. And such as it was with the group that gathered here for the Ghoul stories by the Firelight. Alec was a master storyteller, and he would sit in there and tell and weave and spin tales of ghastly lore of the local woods and tales about old people in the town that no longer living because nefarious deeds had cost them their lives earlier. And even though Alec loved to tell his tales, everyone from Dylan, Gary, Luke, Bradley, and Danny all loved to tell a good ghost story, but they always enjoyed hearing Alec tell his. Well, on one particular night, when they had gathered around the campfire and the night seemed darker than usual, the shadows encroached upon the firelight. Danny was sitting there listening to the stories when they noticed a newcomer come to the fireside with them. And each thinking that he was there with someone else, never said a word. They invited him to come in and join. And they sat, and as they weaved tales and spun tales of fright and conjured up spirits of bygone days that were better off left alone. Only in tales, by the way. They noticed that the stranger seemed quite intrigued by the stories, yet never uttered a word. Well, it came late in the night. Now, the fun part of telling these old tales late in the night is when everybody went their way. Everybody had this kind of like inner dare that all the horrors that they had been telling the stories about were waiting out just beyond the campfire, waiting just beyond the firelight to follow them home and terrorize them at each and every shadow until they were in the safety of their pits. Yeah. And so, when time come for them to all disperse, Alec, Danny, Dylan, Gary, Luke, Bradley all went their own directions. But Danny noticed the stranger got up and began to follow him. Not thinking anything of it, figured, okay, maybe he's just coming this way. Now, this whole time, the stranger has had his hood pulled up over his head. No one has seen his face except for just the bottom of a chin now every once in a while when he'd smile or nod in the midst of a story. Especially a good, ghastly story, he would grin broadly. And Danny swore at times that he could have swore he saw finely sharpened teeth beneath the cowl of his cloak when he would grin. But then they were telling ghost stories, so his imagination could have been running wild with him, at least so he thought. But he did find it slightly uneasy that although the stranger traveled the same path as him, he never spoke. He never said anything, and he seemed to stay at the same agonizing pace that Danny himself would take. So he was relieved when he saw the stranger veer off at one of the corners before they got into town. And so Danny, recalling some of the stories, would see places where some of these stories allegedly had taken place. You know, old Cramerton's Market and the Phantom Butcher that once terrorized the locals there years ago and is said to still haunt the old butchery. And the old woodsman shack where you could hear the cries of people who had been massacred in there by a mad woodsman years ago, before any of the recent families had settled in, and stories such as. But as he come around another corner and began a long, dark stretch home, he noticed a familiar figure standing in front of him up in the distance. It was the hooded figure, the hooded stranger that had joined them for the ghost stories. And he looked as though he were waiting for Danny to show up. And as Danny approached, the stranger waited, and as closer, he drew back his hood. And there, in front of Danny, was a hideous face unlike anything he had ever seen. While all in all, the stranger was humanoid, the facial features bore no likeness thereof, for they were strange bat and dog and animalistic amalgam that was twisted like it had been carved by some madman in a fit of rage and anguish. And it looked at him and beckoned for him to come closer, and even though he didn't, Danny kept his distance and was frightened and took off at a breakneck run. Sadly, the thing took up the chase and come after him. And Danny's lungs heaved with each and every bit of the cold air that assaulted his lungs as he raced up the hill, hoping he could get home with that animalistic beast stranger hot on his tail. He ran, and then just as he thought he could feel the talons of the stranger's hand grasping at his shoulder, he ran across a bridge where the old river gurgled swiftly and harshly underneath. And immediately he was relieved immediately he felt the things leave him alone. And as he stopped and he looked back just long enough to spare a glance back to see where the thing might be, he saw it snarling and pacing the side of the river back and forth, as though it was trying to find a way across to get to him. It would snarl, it would snap, and he would hear guttural, animalistic, and even primal roars and grunts coming from it. It was after him and him alone. No, Danny didn't know why, and the thought horrified him. So he backed up and took off without thinking again about it. He took off and ran all the way home. It was said after that, when people saw Danny, even though he was still a young boy, a streak of gray had formed in his hair from the horrendous sight that he had beheld. But more than that, he knew that if it came after him, it would perhaps be after his friends too. But no one would know until the next time they gathered for the Fireside ghost tales, or for the Ghoul tales by the fireside. I hope you enjoyed that particular story. It is relatively very new, and I will be working on writing it down and refining it. Who knows? Might even be a whispery hollow tale by the time I'm done. Excuse me. That sounds like something we could do for Whispery Hollow. However, for our grand finale tonight, I will take you to the haunted house. Now, the old haunted house just on the inside of town was a favorite local festive haunt attraction that all the kids in the neighborhood and the surrounding towns loved. They loved to come and go into the house and be scared witless by the ghouls and ghosts and monsters that were portrayed in there by some of the local townsfolk, just for the sheer fun of celebrating the Halloween season and giving a memorable night and festivities for the young folk in town. Well, Jeff and Kay had planned all week to go on Halloween night. They looked forward to it. And just as they had gotten their costumes on, well, Jeff dressed as great old Boris Karloff as Frankenstein, and Kay had dressed up as the evil Carmilla from some of the vampire stories and stuff that she had read. And so they got ready to go when their mom come in the room and said, "Guys, I'm sorry, I know y'all were planning on going to the haunted house tonight, but I'm running behind, and I've got some stuff I've got to do. Can you please take Leah trick-or-treating before you go? You just got to take her around the block and then bring her back before, or leave her at your Aunt Polly's before going to the haunted house." Both Jeff and Kay just sighed a harsh breath. "Okay, we'll do it. Oh, come on. I know. I'm sorry that this had to get imposed on your guys' plans, but I wasn't expecting it. It's okay. It's no big deal. We'll just go down around the neighborhood, get some candy. We'll even get some for ourselves, and then drop Polly off drop Leah off at Polly's, and everything will be good." And so they did. They went trick-or-treating, and they took Polly to the neighbor's house and to another house that the neighbor had fixed up like an old graveyard where the excuse me, one moment. Where the candy had been placed inside of an old handmade casket or a coffin that had to open up, and they had to reach inside to get. And then another neighbor had other candies and stuff, and yet another neighbor had their house decked out with horror movie icons, and a guy with a chainsaw and a leather-faced mask come running out chasing them as they got their candy to run them out of the yard and pretend like he was going to go after them. And they squealed, they laughed, they had a good time, despite the fact that taking their little sister to go trick-or-treating and had imposed on their plans. And then before long, they had taken Leah to their Aunt Polly's and was on their way to the haunted house. The haunted house was naturally overloaded with people, stocked up to the brim as people waited almost all the way back to the road as Jeff and Kay approached. A couple of kids saw Jeff dressed as Frankenstein was started acting like they were the Frankenstein's monster, and others complimented them on their outfits, and especially those who saw Kay as Carmilla and loved the way that she had brought the gothic elegance into her style, and they would often sit and talk about it while the line was going on. Eventually it was their turn. And little did they know that as they were going into the old haunted house, a strange mist had started to form inside and around the outside of the house. Any who did see it would probably just chalk it up to ground fog and the cold air. But no, there was something about this, something about it that pulsated with life. And yet, they knew not what it was or felt it. But then, as they went inside, the first few rooms went wonderfully. They encountered a barber shop that, when the lights went out and the strobes began, a cabinet opened up with all the heads that were collected from the barber who had sheared not only the hair off of their Charge's head, but sheared their head off completely at their shoulders, neck and all, and had placed them on display in bulbous globes that was in there. And he threatened to grab somebody from the crowd before they got out the next. And then they went into another room where an old gravekeeper was digging the graves and talking about how in hitting the coffin with his shovel to calm down whatever was chained up inside. And then when the lights strobed, the chain broke and the grave robber joined the ranks of the dead as it was drug into the grave by the creature that he was trying to bury, and it come out and come after and this formless creature come up after the crowd as they cheered and jeered and screamed and went to the next. But then it began to get weird. They went into the gorilla room. And the gorilla room, at first all was fine, but there was an eerie mist, almost as like a fog machine had been let loose into the room. But yet it was only at that point in that room, though when things were quiet, they would swear they could hear voices in the fog. But then oftentimes they would chalk it up to, okay, maybe just be the group ahead of us or another part of the haunted house. But when it got weird is when the gorilla grabbed bars and started begging for help as he was trying to push his face through the bars. And at first everybody was laughing and cheering because they thought it was a part of the show. Until the mist wrapped itself around the gorilla and began slamming it against the makeshift bars until it broke everything down, and the gorilla heaved a horrible final breath with the sound of help. And at that moment, they could hear terrible cries of anguish in the room they had just come out of. About that time, one of the ushers come in with a flashlight. Guys, come on this way. This is not part of the show. Come on, let's get out of here. And as they did, they could start hearing the wails of things that were coming up, entering the house. Some of the people were pulled up and pulled into the shadows, never to be seen again. As they looked back in the void, they could see what looked like shimmering eyes watching them and getting closer. And as the people standing next to Jeff started to move, gangrenous, just gnarled and decaying arms just reached out and grabbed and started clawing and drugging into the wall, leaving nothing left of them but a crimson smear of where they once were. With that, Jeff and Kay knew that something was definitely wrong, and they raced to catch up with the usher who led them through the house. And as they went from room to room, the strobes were going off, and the mists, they could see eerily inhuman forms attacking and assaulting and molesting and just otherwise completely ravaging the people in the haunted house. And they finally ran down the steps and Jeff felt a nasty claw go down his arm, and he flinched and saw the grooves that were starting to fill with blood were from where the hands had tried to grab him. And he grabbed Kay and pushed her forward and continued running, trying to protect his sister as well as get himself out of there. The usher got him to the final window. The door was locked and wouldn't open. They were trapped in the house. So the usher smashed the window and was trying to let them, and got Kay and Jeff outside the window. And just as the usher was about to crawl in, the hands wrapped around him and pulled him back in. And a thunderous boom shocked and just shook the entire house. And then Jeff and Kay took off running and got out, and they were back in the yard of the old haunted house. And somehow it was after midnight. The mists, the ground fog has started to deteriorate off, and the streets were empty, save for the occasional car that passed by. There was no sign of the old haunted house being open. There was no sign of anyone having been there, as though it were late enough that everybody had gone home. Yet they had only been in the haunted house roughly 20 minutes, or maybe 30 at the most. There was still plenty of night ahead. Even Jeff's watch said so. Yet, the streets were empty. And the old clock from the church was dinging. Boom, boom, all the way up to 1, 2 in the morning. Where did the time go? And so, as they looked around and felt the cold wind and the darkness close in on them once more, they took comfort in an old street light. As they made their way home, concerned and trying to figure out the events that took place that night, feeling like evil eyes were still watching them, even as they looked into the dying candlelights of distant jack-o'-lanterns. It was said that the old haunted house closed after that, never opened again. And so that was the last night that the old haunted house would ever be used for that. And the people who had come up missing were just that. They were reported missing. None had ever heard from them or saw them ever again. And though their pictures still grace the missing boards, none would ever believe nor conceive the ideas that took place that dreadful Halloween night in the old haunted house. All right, everyone, I'd like to thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed these original ghost stories, and I hope that I will talk to you again soon, and I hope to be back in front of you live again, and perhaps with a guest, especially for our final nights. All right, everyone, have a good evening, good weekend, happy Halloween, God bless, and we'll see you again soon.